We all know what it feels like to be dismissed, forgotten, told we don't matter. The pain of being cast aside cuts deeper than any blade, leaving scars that never quite heal. In the frozen borderlands of the Northern Kingdom, Alpha King Torric lies bleeding in the snow, betrayed by those he trusted most. The most powerful ruler in generations faces his final hour alone in the wilderness. Then she finds him, Elira, the quiet healer who was exiled years ago for bearing the mark of an Omega, deemed too weak to matter. In her modest cottage, she tends to wounds that run deeper than flesh. She discovers that beneath the hardened warrior lies a man haunted by loss and desperate for redemption. As winter loosens its grip, an impossible bond forms between the exiled woman and the dying king. But can love survive when old enemies return? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The cottage stood like a quiet sentinel among the towering pines, its smoke rising thin and straight in the still winter air. Elira had built this refuge with her own hands 7 years ago, after the king's decree had stripped her of everything she'd once called home. The wooden walls bore the marks of countless storms weathered, the roof patched with care and determination that spoke of a woman who refused to surrender to despair. Inside, the single room held the accumulated wisdom of generations. Dried herbs hung in careful bundles from the rafters, their scents mingling into something that spoke of healing and hope. The ancient pendant at her throat, a simple piece of carved moonstone that had belonged to her grandmother, caught the firelight as she moved between her shelves of remedies. Most believed it mere jewelry, but Elira knew better. When her healing touch was needed most, the stone would warm against her skin, glowing with a light so faint others dismissed it as imagination. She had been the daughter of the kingdom's most trusted healer once. Marcus of Whitehall had served 3 kings, his knowledge of medicine and herbcraft legendary throughout the realm. Elira had learned at his side, absorbing not just the recipes for tinctures and salves, but the deeper understanding that true healing came from seeing the whole person, body, mind and spirit intertwined. That knowledge had made her dangerous. According to King Torric's advisors, the purge had come swift and merciless in the dead of winter 7 years past. One by one, those bearing the mark of Omega heritage were rounded up, accused of harboring seditious magical abilities that threatened the natural order. The Alpha bloodlines, they proclaimed, were the rightful rulers, while Omegas were weak links in the chain of civilization, their very existence an affront to proper hierarchy. Elira's father had been among the first to fall, not because he possessed any threat to the crown, but because he had discovered something he should not have. Correspondence that suggested the Omega persecution was built on fabricated evidence. They found him in his study one morning, officially dead of a weak heart. Though Elira had noted the subtle signs of poisoning that others missed, she had fled before they came for her, taking only her healing supplies and the pendant that marked her as the last of her bloodline. The forest had welcomed her, as it had welcomed many outcasts before. Here, among the ancient trees that remembered when Alphas and Omegas had ruled as equals, she had built a new life focused on the quiet work of healing. The animals came to her first, wounded deer, sick foxes, birds with broken wings. Word spread in the way such things do among the forest folk, and soon the occasional woodsman or trapper would find his way to her door, hat in hand, asking for help that the kingdom's remaining healers either could not or would not provide. Old Willem was the first human to trust her completely. A grizzled man of 60 winters, he'd served as the kingdom's master tracker until age, and a war injury had forced his retirement to these remote woods. He'd arrived at her door 3 winters ago, fevered and delirious from an infected wound, and she'd spent 4 days bringing him back from the edge of death. "You've got the gift, girl," he'd told her when he was well enough to sit up. "Same as your father had, but stronger. There's old magic in you. The kind that built this kingdom before fools started dividing folk into worthy and worthless." Willem had become her closest friend and protector, checking on her regularly and bringing news from the world beyond the trees. It was through him she learned that King Torric had never taken a queen, despite the pressure from his council to produce an heir. It was through Willem she heard whispers that the king seemed haunted by the choices he'd made, that he often rode alone to the sites of old battles and stared into the distance, as if searching for something he'd lost. A man can carry only so much guilt before it breaks him, Willem had observed. And that king's been carrying the weight of the world since he took the crown. Elira tried not to think about such things. The man who had signed her people's death warrant was not her concern. She had her work, her quiet life, her purpose in healing what was broken in this small corner of the world. The pendant at her throat hummed with contentment when she worked, as if approving of the path she'd chosen. The cottage itself had become a sanctuary in more ways than one. She'd planted gardens that thrived even in harsh conditions, learning to coax life from soil that others deemed barren. The walls were lined with shelves, holding not just medicines, but books, volumes on healing that she'd managed to save from her father's collection, journals where she recorded her own discoveries, and ancient texts that spoke of times when healing was considered the highest of arts. Her days followed a peaceful rhythm. Dawn brought meditation and the tending of plants that grew in the wooden boxes by her windows. Morning was for preparing medicines, grinding herbs, brewing tinctures, creating the salves that could mend both flesh and spirit. Afternoons brought visitors, both animal and human, seeking help. Evenings were for study and reflection, reading by candlelight and adding to her ever-growing understanding of the healer's craft. She had friends among the forest dwellers, not just Willem, but the quiet family of trappers who lived a day's walk north, the hermit philosopher who'd built his cabin by the stream, the traveling merchants who knew they could find safe harbor at her door. They formed a small community of sorts, bound not by law or obligation, but by mutual respect and care. It was a good life, she told herself, a meaningful life. If sometimes she felt the ache of loneliness, if sometimes she wondered what it might have been like to practice her healing arts in the great halls of the castle, to have apprentices of her own, to be part of the grand tradition her father had served, well, such thoughts were merely the echo of old dreams, harmless as long as she didn't dwell on them too long. The pendant at her throat would warm during those moments of wistfulness, as if reminding her that some paths, however different from what we'd planned, could still lead to places of profound purpose. Tonight, as the wind howled through the pines and snow fell thick beyond her windows, Elira felt that familiar warmth begin to build. But this time it was different, urgent, insistent, pulling her attention toward the door, even though no visitor had knocked. She set down her mortar and pestle, the half-ground feverfew forgotten as she moved toward the window. Outside, the world was a swirl of white, visibility reduced to mere yards. No sensible person would be traveling in such weather, but the pendant's warmth grew stronger, and with it came a certainty that had guided her through 7 years of exile. Someone needed her help, someone whose life hung in the balance. Elira wrapped her heaviest cloak around her shoulders, gathered her emergency supplies, and stepped into the storm. The pendant's glow, barely visible beneath her clothing, pulsed like a heartbeat as she followed its guidance into the swirling snow. She had no idea that she was walking toward a meeting that would change not just her own fate, but the destiny of the entire kingdom. The body in the snow was massive, dressed in the kind of fine leathers and furs that spoke of wealth and status. But it was the ring on his bloodied hand that made Elira's breath catch in her throat, a heavy signet bearing the crowned wolf of the royal house, a symbol she knew from her childhood days in the castle when her father had served the crown. She knelt beside the fallen man, her healer's training overriding the shock of recognition. His breathing was shallow, his skin pale as the snow around him, but he lived. Blood seeped from wounds across his torso, and his left leg lay at an angle that suggested broken bones. The pendant at her throat blazed with warmth now, responding to the magnitude of injury and the urgent need for intervention. This was King Torric himself, The man whose signature had condemned her people, whose decree had driven her into exile, whose very existence had been the shadow hanging over her peaceful life in the forest, and he was dying. For a long moment, Elira remained frozen in the snow, her hands hovering above his body. This was the moment she could choose. She could walk away. Let nature take its course. Let the man who had destroyed so many lives face his judgment in whatever realm awaited beyond death. Her father's murder, her people's suffering, the years of loneliness and exile, all of it could be answered with simple inaction. But the pendant's warmth pulsed against her skin, and with it came the memory of her father's voice. A healer serves life itself, daughter. Not kings or kingdoms, not politics or revenge. Life itself, in all its forms, sacred and worthy of preservation. Her hands began to move of their own accord, checking pulse and breathing, assessing the severity of wounds. The king had been savagely beaten, likely by multiple attackers, and left to die in the storm. Despite everything he had done, despite the pain his choices had caused, he was still a human being whose life hung by the thinnest of threads. "Damn you," she whispered. But her voice held resignation rather than anger. She could not be other than what she was, a healer first, last, and always. The journey back to her cottage was a nightmare of dragging weight through deepening snow. Torric was unconscious but heavy, his body dead weight that tested every muscle in her body. By the time she managed to get him through her door and onto her simple cot, she was exhausted, and the pendant at her throat was glowing bright enough to see by. She worked through the night, drawing on every skill her father had taught her and more, techniques that came from deeper knowledge, older wisdom that lived in her blood and bones. The pendant's light guided her hands as she cleaned wounds, set the broken leg, and fed him drop by drop the strengthening broths that would give his body fuel to fight. Dawn found her slumped in her chair beside the cot, watching the steady rise and fall of his chest. He would live, barring infection or unforeseen complications. But more than that, something in his face had changed during the night's healing. The harsh lines of authority and suspicion had softened, revealing features that might once have been kind, even gentle. It was midday when his eyes opened. They were grey as storm clouds, but alert and intelligent despite his ordeal. For a moment he stared at the ceiling of her cottage, clearly trying to understand where he was and how he'd come to be there. When his gaze found her face, recognition dawned slowly, followed by confusion. Then something approaching wonder. "I know you," he said, his voice rough with disuse but stronger than she'd expected. "Marcus's daughter, the healer who disappeared." Elira kept her expression carefully neutral. "My name is Elira. You were wounded and left in the snow. I brought you here." He tried to sit up, winced at the pain in his ribs, and settled back against her pillows. Why? The question hung between them, weighted with years of history and hurt. Why had she saved the man who destroyed her world? Why risk her own safety to aid someone who would likely see her exiled again, or worse, once he recovered? "Because you were dying," she said simply. "And I am what I am." Something shifted in his expression, a crack in the armor of kingship that let her glimpse the man underneath. "A healer, yes. They told me your people were dangerous, that Omegas possessed uncontrolled magic that threatened the stability of the realm." His eyes fixed on hers, searching. "They said you could not be trusted with power over life and death." Elira felt the old anger rise, but she kept her voice level. "And what do you think now, Your Majesty? Do I seem dangerous to you?" He was quiet for a long time, his gaze moving around her simple cottage, the dried herbs, the carefully organized medicines, the books that spoke of a life dedicated to learning and healing. When he looked at her again, she saw something she had never expected to see in a king's eyes. "Shame, I think," he said slowly, "that I have made terrible mistakes." The admission hung in the air between them, more shocking than if he had threatened her with execution. Kings did not apologize, did not acknowledge error, did not show vulnerability to their subjects, especially not to exiled ones. "Why were you in the forest?" she asked, deflecting from the dangerous territory of his regrets. His jaw tightened. "Ambushed on the northern border. My own scouts led me into a trap. He paused, and she saw him make the decision to trust her with truth. "My brother's men, I suspect, though I cannot prove it. Your brother wants you dead. My brother wants the crown." Torric's voice carried the weariness of a man who had seen too much betrayal. "I have no heir, no queen, no direct succession. If I were to die in battle, fighting bravely for the realm, he would be the natural choice to rule." Elira absorbed this information, understanding dawning. "But you didn't die?" "No, thanks to you." He studied her face. "Though I wonder if you regret that choice, given what my reign has cost you." The question demanded honesty, and she found herself giving it. "There have been moments, lying here watching you breathe, when I wondered the same thing. And I realized that the man I pulled from the snow is not the same man who signed those death warrants. Pain changes people. Suffering teaches wisdom if we let it." He was quiet for a long time, processing her words. "You sound like your father. He always said the deepest healing happened in the spirit, not the body." The mention of her father brought fresh grief, but also something else, a connection across the years to the man she had loved and lost. He believed that healing was about restoration, making things whole again, returning them to what they were meant to be. And what was I meant to be? The question was barely a whisper, but it carried the weight of years of doubt. Elira looked at him, really looked, seeing past the crown and the title to the man who lay broken in her simple bed. What she saw surprised her. Not a tyrant, but someone who had lost his way and was desperate to find it again. "I think," she said carefully, "that's something only you can answer." Outside, the storm was beginning to calm, but inside the cottage, a different kind of storm was just beginning, one that would reshape both their lives in ways neither could yet imagine. 3 days passed in careful routine. Each morning, Elira would wake to find Torric already conscious, watching her with those storm-grey eyes as she moved about her small domain. She would check his wounds, replace bandages, and prepare the herbal medicines that were speeding his recovery, far beyond what normal healing should allow. He was an observant patient, she discovered. While she worked, he asked questions, not about her techniques, but about her life. Where had she learned to cultivate winter herbs? How had she managed to create a garden that thrived in such harsh conditions? What did she do during the long months when snow blocked the forest paths? At first she answered briefly, professionally, maintaining the distance between healer and patient. But gradually his genuine curiosity wore down her defenses. There was something in his voice when he asked these questions, a hunger for understanding that seemed to go beyond mere politeness. "You've built something beautiful here," he said on the third morning, gesturing toward her shelves of medicines and carefully preserved foods. "A life of purpose." "It's a simple life," she replied, grinding dried willow bark for his pain relief. "Some would call it primitive, some would be fools." His voice carried conviction. "I've lived in palaces, Elira. I've been surrounded by luxury and ceremony, and 100 people, whose only purpose was to serve my comfort. But I've never felt the peace that lives in these walls." She paused in her grinding, studying his face. "Peace is something we create within ourselves, Your Majesty. It cannot be found in places or possessions. Call me Torric." The request surprised them both. "Please, in this place you've built, I'd like to remember who I was before the crown claimed me." The medicinal recipe book lay open beside her, its pages filled with her careful handwriting. Notes and observations accumulated over 7 years of solitary practice. She'd written not just ingredients and proportions, but stories of the people she'd helped, observations about the connection between physical ailments and emotional wounds, theories about healing that went far beyond traditional medicine. "May I?" Torric gestured toward the book. She hesitated, then nodded. The book was her life's work, intimate in a way that felt dangerous to share. But something in his manner suggested he would treat it with respect. He read slowly, his expression growing increasingly thoughtful. "This is remarkable," he said finally. "You've documented things here that the royal physicians never considered. This connection between grief and stomach ailments, between fear and problems with breathing. How did you discover these patterns?" By listening, she said simply. When people are in pain, they tell stories. If you pay attention to those stories, you begin to see how the body and spirit affect each other. The royal physicians treat symptoms. You treat people. I learned from my father that healing isn't about imposing our will on the body. It's about supporting the body's own wisdom, its desire to be whole. That afternoon, as she prepared their simple meal, rabbit stew with forest vegetables and herbs, she became aware of him watching her with new attention. Not the careful observation of a patient studying his healer, but something deeper and more personal. "What troubles you?" she asked, setting a bowl beside his bed. "I'm trying to understand how someone who has every reason to hate me can show such kindness." He took a spoonful of the stew, chewed thoughtfully. "This is better than anything served in the castle kitchens. Hatred is a poison that hurts the one who carries it more than its target," she replied, settling into her chair with her own meal. "I learned that long ago, but surely you must feel something. Anger, at least. Your father was murdered because of my policies. Your people were scattered or killed. You've spent 7 years in exile because of choices I made." She was quiet for a long time, considering her words carefully. "I felt all of those things once. The anger nearly consumed me that first winter. I would lie awake planning elaborate revenges, imagining scenarios where you would suffer as I had suffered. What changed? Old Willem found me one day at the end of that first winter, sitting by the stream with my father's knife in my hands. The memory was still painful, but sharing it felt right somehow. I was planning to walk to the castle and try to kill you. I knew I would die in the attempt, but I thought it would be worth it." Torric stopped eating, his full attention on her words. Willem sat beside me and asked a single question. "Will this bring your father back?" When I said no, he asked, "Will this heal the wounds in your heart?" Again, no. Finally, he asked, "Will this make the world a better place, or will it just add more pain to what's already here?" And you chose healing over revenge. I chose life over death. Not just your life, but my own, and the lives of all the people who might benefit from the skills my father taught me. She met his eyes directly. "Revenge would have made me a killer. Healing makes me who I was meant to be." The silence that followed was comfortable rather than tense. Outside, she could hear the forest settling into evening, the soft calls of night birds, the rustle of small creatures beginning their nocturnal hunts, the whisper of wind through pine branches. "Tell me about your father," Torric said suddenly. The request surprised her, but she found herself complying. She spoke of Marcus's gentleness, his infinite patience with difficult patients, his belief that every life had value regardless of station or circumstances. She described his laughter, his terrible jokes, his way of humming while he worked that made even the sickest patients feel safe. "He sounds like a remarkable man," Torric said when she finished. "I remember him, you know. He treated me once when I was a boy, after I fell from my horse during a hunting expedition. He had the kindest hands, gentle but sure, and he told me stories while he worked to distract me from the pain. He always said that stories were medicine too. That sometimes people needed hope more than they needed herbs." He was right. Torric's voice was soft. "I wish—" He stopped, shook his head. "What do you wish?" "I wish I had been wise enough to listen to him when he tried to warn me about the Omega persecution. I wish I had been strong enough to resist the pressure from my advisors. I wish I had been the kind of king your father believed I could be." The words hung between them, an admission of regret that changed something fundamental in their relationship. He was no longer just her patient, and she was no longer simply his reluctant savior. They were two people who had been shaped by loss and were trying to find their way towards something better. That night, as Torric slept, Elira sat by her window watching the stars emerge through breaking clouds. The pendant at her throat was warm but quiet, its earlier urgency replaced by something that felt almost like contentment. Perhaps this was why she had been guided to find him in the snow, not just to save his life, but to help him remember who he truly was beneath the weight of crown and duty. By the end of the first week, Torric was able to sit up without pain and take short walks around the cottage. His strength returned with remarkable speed, aided by Elira's medicines and what seemed to be an inner vitality that had been dormant for years. She caught him sometimes staring out the window with an expression she couldn't quite read, part wonder, part longing, as if he was seeing the world with new eyes. "I never noticed how many different shades of green exist in a forest," he said one morning, watching sunlight filter through the pine canopy. "At the castle I see gardens, carefully planned and maintained. But this," he gestured toward the wild beauty beyond her door, "this has a life of its own. The forest existed long before the kingdom was founded," Elira replied, joining him at the window. "It will exist long after kingdoms rise and fall. There's wisdom in that kind of permanence." "Permanence," he repeated the word as if tasting it. "I thought ruling was about permanence. Building institutions that would last, creating laws that would endure. But all I've really built is fear and division." She was about to respond when they heard the sound of approaching footsteps. Torric tensed, instinctively reaching for a sword that wasn't there, but Elira recognized the familiar gait. "It's Willem," she said. "He checks on me regularly." The old tracker appeared at her door with his usual mixture of gruffness and concern. "Morning, lass. Thought I'd—" He stopped mid-sentence when he saw Torric, his weathered face cycling through surprise, recognition, and something approaching anger. "Your Majesty," Willem said, his tone carefully neutral. "Willem," Torric inclined his head. "I remember you. Master Tracker, retired after the border. War. I lost 3 fingers and gained." Some sense in that conflict. Willem's eyes flicked to Elira. "This is why you've been so scarce. Lately?" "He was dying in the snow," she said. "Simply." Willem studied Torric for a long moment, then nodded slowly. "She saved your life, then?" "She did. And what do you plan to do about that?" The question hung in the air, loaded with implications. Torric could have Elira arrested for harboring him without reporting to the authorities. He could use her knowledge of his location to reclaim his throne and forget this interlude ever happened. Or he could honor the debt in ways that went beyond simple gratitude. "I plan to learn," Torric said quietly. "To understand what I've been blind to for too long." Willem's expression softened slightly. "Learning's good, though some lessons come dear." Over the following days, Willem became a regular presence at the cottage, initially suspicious but gradually warming to the strange situation. He brought news from the wider world, rumors of the king's disappearance, speculation about succession, reports of unrest in the eastern provinces. "Your brother's been busy," Willem reported on his 3rd visit. "Consolidating power, calling in favors, positioning himself as the natural successor. Word is, he's planning to petition the council for official recognition as regent. How long before that becomes permanent?" Torric asked. "Depends on how long you stay dead," Willem replied bluntly. "The longer you're missing, the more legitimate his claim becomes." These conversations revealed a side of kingship that Elira had never considered, the delicate balance of power that could shift with a single absence. The way authority depended as much on perception as on law. She found herself drawn into discussions about governance and leadership, offering perspectives that seemed to surprise both men. "You speak as if you've thought deeply about these matters," Torric observed, after she'd made a particularly insightful comment about the relationship between a ruler and his people. "My father often discussed politics with me," she replied. "He believed that healers needed to understand the forces that created suffering if they hoped to address its causes." "And what did you conclude?" Elira was quiet for a moment, organizing thoughts she'd never been asked to articulate before. "I concluded that most suffering comes from disconnection. When rulers lose touch with their people, when the strong stop caring for the weak, when we begin to see others as less than fully human, that's when cruelty becomes possible. The Omega persecution," Torric said heavily, "among other things." That evening, as Willem prepared to return to his own cabin, he pulled Elira aside. "Be careful, lass. I can see what's happening here, and so will others." "What do you mean?" "I mean the way you look at each other. The way he listens when you speak, like your words are water to a man dying of thirst. And the way you watch him when you think he's not looking, like you're seeing someone you never expected to find. Heat rose in Elira's cheeks. He's my patient. He's a man, and you're a woman, and healing someone creates bonds that go deeper than medicine. Willem's voice was gentle but concerned. Just remember that when this ends, and it will end, one way or another, he goes back to being a king, and you remain what you've always been in the eyes of his world. His words stayed with her through the night, forcing her to examine feelings she'd been trying to ignore. There was truth in what Willem had said. She was drawn to Torric in ways that had nothing to do with her role as healer. She found herself looking forward to their conversations, enjoying the play of intelligence in his eyes when they debated some point of philosophy or governance. But more than that, she was beginning to see glimpses of the man he might have been without the weight of kingship, someone curious and thoughtful, capable of admitting error and genuinely interested in understanding perspectives different from his own. The next morning brought a test of these growing feelings. Torric had found the bloodline scroll hidden among her father's papers, an ancient document that traced the genealogies of the kingdom's founding families. His face was grave when he looked up from reading it. "This changes everything," he said quietly. "What do you mean?" "According to this, Omega families weren't outcasts or lesser beings. They were the kingdom's original healers, diplomats, and wisdom keepers. The persecution wasn't about maintaining order. It was about eliminating a perceived threat to alpha dominance. The weight of this revelation settled between them. If true, it meant that everything Torric had been told about the necessity of the purge was a lie. It meant that her father and hundreds of others had died, not to protect the kingdom, but to preserve the power of those who feared their influence. "My advisors must have known," Torric continued, his voice tight with anger. "They must have hidden this from me deliberately, or someone hid it from them as well," Elira said carefully. "Lies can be passed down through generations, becoming truth through repetition, but even as she offered this gentler interpretation, she saw the pain in his eyes, the agony of a man discovering that his deepest failures might have been based on deception. That night, unable to sleep, she heard him moving restlessly on his cot. When she looked over, she found him sitting up, staring into the dying fire. "I keep thinking about all the lives that might have been saved if I had been braver," he said without looking at her. "If I had questioned more, trusted less, thought for myself instead of accepting what others told me was necessary." "You can't change the past," she said gently. "No, but I can try to do better going forward." He turned to face her, and in the firelight she saw something that made her breath catch, a look of such intensity and purpose that it transformed his entire face. "If I survive this, if I reclaim my throne, I want you to help me. Help you how? Help me rebuild what was broken. Help me create a kingdom worthy of your father's faith and yours." The request hung between them, weighted with possibility and danger in equal measure. To accept would mean stepping out of the safety of exile and into a world that had already proven its willingness to destroy her. But to refuse would mean abandoning the chance to heal wounds that went far beyond individual suffering. Looking into his eyes, seeing the man he was becoming rather than the king he had been, Elira felt her carefully constructed defenses beginning to crumble. Perhaps Willem was right about the bonds that healing created, because what she felt for Torric was growing far beyond professional concern or even friendship. It was becoming something that could reshape both their worlds if they were brave enough to let it. Spring arrived early that year, as if the world itself was awakening alongside the changes taking place within the cottage walls. Snow melted in rushing streams down the mountainside, revealing patches of earth ready for new growth. Elira found herself working in her garden with renewed energy, expanding the plots and planting seeds that would sustain not just herself, but potentially others who might need sanctuary. Torric had grown strong enough to help with the heavier work, and she was surprised by how naturally he took to the tasks. His hands, accustomed to holding scepters and signing royal decrees, proved surprisingly adept at building raised beds and digging irrigation channels. "I worked in the castle gardens as a boy," he explained when she commented on his skill, "before my tutors decided that physical labor was beneath a prince's dignity. I'd forgotten how satisfying it could be to create something with your own hands." They worked in comfortable silence, the easy rhythm of shared labor creating its own form of intimacy. Elira found herself intensely aware of his presence, the sound of his breathing, the efficiency of his movements, the way sunlight caught the silver threads in his dark hair. These feelings both thrilled and terrified her, representing territory far more dangerous than her simple life in exile had prepared her to navigate. One evening, as they sat by the fire after their meal, Torric pulled out the ancient map of bloodlines she had discovered among her father's papers. The document was illuminated with careful artwork, showing family trees that stretched back to the kingdom's founding. "Look at this," he said, pointing to a section near the top of the parchment. "The original royal line, my ancestors, they married into Omega families regularly. It wasn't seen as diluting the bloodline, but as strengthening it." Elira leaned closer to study the map, her shoulder brushing against his. The contact sent warmth through her entire body, a reaction she tried to ignore. "The patterns are clear once you know to look for them. Alpha families provided leadership and protection, while Omega families offered wisdom, healing, and what the old texts call the sight beyond sight, magic." "You mean understanding, intuition, the ability to see connections that others miss." She traced one of the illustrated family trees with her finger. "My grandmother used to say that Omega gifts weren't about power over others, but about power with others, the ability to heal, to build bridges, to find solutions where none seemed to exist." Torric was quiet for a long moment, studying not the map, but her face. "You have that gift. I've seen it in how you work with patients, how you understand what they need before they can articulate it themselves. All healers develop such skills with practice." "No," he said firmly, "this is different. What you do goes beyond medical knowledge. It's as if you can sense the deeper wounds that need healing, the ones that can't be seen with the eye." The intensity in his voice made her look up, and she found herself caught in his gaze. Something had shifted between them over the past weeks, a growing awareness that hummed beneath their daily interactions like a current waiting to spark into flame. "There's something else," he said, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Something I discovered in my mother's private papers before I left for the border." He reached into his pack and withdrew a leather portfolio she hadn't seen before. From it, he pulled several letters tied with faded ribbon, correspondence between his parents during their courtship and early marriage. "Read this," he said, handing her one of the letters. The handwriting was feminine and elegant, but it was the content that made Elira's breath catch. The letter spoke of dreams that came true, of an unusual sensitivity to others' emotions, of a healing touch that went beyond conventional medicine. "Your mother had Omega heritage," Elira said, the implications hitting her like a physical blow, hidden for generations, but yes. She was descended from the Silverwood line, one of the most powerful Omega families before the first purges began, a century before my reign. Torric's voice was heavy with the weight of this revelation. Which means you carry that bloodline too." Elira set the letter down with trembling hands. "The king who ordered the Omega persecution is himself part Omega." The irony was devastating. But more than that, it explained things that had puzzled her about Torric's rapid recovery. His intuitive understanding of people and situations. The way he seemed to respond to the forest itself as if it spoke to him. "My advisors must never have known," he said. "Or perhaps some did. And that's why they were so insistent about the need to eliminate the Omega threat. Perhaps they feared what would happen if the truth came to light." Elira stood and moved to the window, needing space to process this revelation. Outside, the forest was coming alive with spring, new leaves unfurling, Flowers beginning to bloom, the whole world engaged in the ancient dance of renewal and growth. "This changes everything," she said finally. "Does it?" He had followed her to the window, standing close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from his body. "Does it change how you see me?" She turned to face him, studying the familiar features with new understanding. The grey eyes that seemed to see too much, the hands that had learned to tend plants with unusual skill, the way he listened to people as if hearing layers of meaning others missed. All of it made sense now. "It helps me understand who you really are beneath the crown," she said. "But Torric, if this became known, it would either destroy my ability to rule or transform the kingdom entirely." He reached out, his fingers barely touching her arm. "That's why I need you, Elira, not just as a healer, but as someone who understands what it means to bridge these two worlds." The touch of his hand sent electricity through her entire body, and she saw in his eyes that he felt it too, this growing attraction that neither of them had been willing to acknowledge directly. They stood there for a moment, balanced on the edge of something that could change both their lives irrevocably. "There are prophecies," she said suddenly, pulling back from the dangerous intensity of the moment. "Old texts that speak of a time when the bloodlines would reunite, when an Alpha King and an Omega Queen would rule together and heal the divisions that had torn the kingdom apart. You think we're part of that prophecy?" "I think," she said carefully, "that prophecies have a way of fulfilling themselves when people are brave enough to act on them." That night, Elira lay awake listening to the sound of Torric's breathing, her mind racing with the implications of everything they'd discovered. The pendant at her throat was warm against her skin, pulsing gently as if responding to her elevated emotional state. She had spent 7 years building a life of careful solitude, protecting herself from the pain of connection and loss. But now, in the space of a few weeks, all of those defenses were crumbling. She was falling in love with a man whose world had destroyed everything she'd once held dear, and more terrifyingly, she was beginning to believe that he was falling in love with her too. The sound of movement made her turn toward his cot. He was sitting up, silhouetted against the dying firelight, and she realized he had been as unable to sleep as she was. "Elira," he said quietly, "what we discovered tonight, about my heritage, about the prophecies, it doesn't have to mean anything you don't want it to mean. I would never ask you to sacrifice your safety or happiness for political necessity, and what if it's not sacrifice?" The words were out of her mouth before she could stop them, revealing more than she'd intended about the state of her heart. The silence that followed was charged with possibility. Then she heard him rise from his cot, heard his bare feet crossing the wooden floor. He stopped beside her chair, close enough that she could see the conflict in his expression, desire warring with honor, hope wrestling with the practical realities of their different stations. "Then," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "we would have to be very brave indeed." Outside, spring rain began to fall, washing away the last traces of winter and preparing the ground for whatever new growth might take root in its wake. The revelation about Torric's Omega heritage changed the dynamic between them in ways both subtle and profound. Over the following days, Elira watched him discover abilities he'd never known he possessed. A heightened awareness of the forest's rhythms, an intuitive understanding of which plants would thrive where, an almost uncanny ability to sense when her animal patients needed extra attention. "It's like waking up after a lifetime of half-sleep," he told her one morning as they worked together in the expanded garden. "I can feel things I never noticed before. The way the earth responds to touch, the way plants communicate their needs. Is this what it's always been like for you?" "Not always," she replied, carefully transplanting seedlings into larger pots. "The abilities grew stronger after I came to live in the forest, as if being in exile freed something that had been constrained by trying to fit into the kingdom's narrow definitions of what I should be." They were planting medicinal herbs, feverfew and willowbark, comfrey and echinacea, expanding her pharmacy in preparation for the increased demand that would come with spring's arrival. Torric had proven surprisingly adept at understanding which combinations of plants would grow well together, as if he could sense their natural partnerships. "I keep thinking about my mother," he said, pausing in his work to study a handful of seeds. "All those times, she seemed to know things she couldn't possibly know, when the border conflicts would flare up. Which of my father's advisors could be trusted? When storms were coming long before the weather turned, they all attributed it to feminine intuition, but it was so much more than that. She was protecting both you and herself by hiding her true nature," Elira observed. "In a world that saw Omega gifts as threats, revealing her abilities would have put you both in danger, and now I'm learning that I carry the same gifts." He looked at her with an expression that mixed wonder and concern. "What does that make me, Elira? Am I still fit to rule, knowing that everything I was taught about the hierarchy of bloodlines was a lie?" The question went to the heart of everything they'd been dancing around. She set down her trowel and faced him directly, noting how the morning light caught the silver in his hair and emphasized the lines that spoke of years of difficult decisions. "I think it makes you exactly the kind of ruler this kingdom needs," she said. "Someone who understands what it means to be both strong and vulnerable. Someone who can bridge the divisions that have torn your people apart." Their eyes met and held, and she saw the moment when his careful restraint finally crumbled. He reached for her, his hands cupping her face with the same gentle precision he used when tending plants, and she didn't pull away. The kiss that followed was soft and tentative at first, then deeper as she responded, her hands finding the solid warmth of his chest beneath his simple tunic. When they broke apart, both breathing unsteadily, the pendant at her throat was glowing bright enough to see even in the daylight, a clear sign that something momentous had just occurred. "I've been wanting to do that for weeks," he admitted, his thumbs tracing the lines of her cheekbones. "I know," she whispered. "I've wanted it too. This complicates everything." "Yes, it does." But despite the acknowledgement of the difficulties ahead, neither of them pulled away. Instead, they spent the morning working side by side with a new easiness, as if the admission of their feelings had removed a barrier that had been constraining them both. It was Willem who brought news of the outside world that afternoon, arriving with his usual combination of bluntness and concern. But this time, his report carried an urgency that cut through their newfound happiness like a blade. "Your brother's moved faster than expected," he told Torric without preamble. "He's called for a formal declaration of your death and a coronation ceremony within the month. Claims he has evidence that you were killed by bandits on the northern border." "Evidence?" Torric's voice was sharp. "Bloodied clothing, pieces of your armor, even your father's ceremonial sword, all found at what looked like a massacre site." Willem's expression was grim. "Either he's very thorough, or he had help from people who knew exactly what evidence would be most convincing." The implications hit Elira like a physical blow. If Torric was officially declared dead, any attempt to reclaim his throne would be seen as an imposture. More than that, the ceremony would legitimize his brother's rule in ways that would be almost impossible to reverse. "How long do we have?" Torric asked. 3 weeks, maybe 4, if the weather delays travel from the outer provinces." Willem studied both their faces, noting the new intimacy between them. "There's something else you need to know." Word spread about a mysterious healer in the forest, someone with unusual abilities who's been helping people the castle physicians couldn't cure. "Your brother's people have been asking questions." Elira felt her blood turn cold. "They're looking for me. They're looking for anyone who might threaten the new order. Omega survivors, healers with unusual gifts, anyone who might contradict the official story about your people being dangerous." Willem's voice was gentle but firm. "You can't stay here much longer, lass. It's not safe for either of you." That evening, as they sat by the fire discussing their limited options, Elira found herself studying Torric's face in the flickering light. The easy contentment of the morning had been replaced by the weight of decision, the knowledge that their brief interlude in the forest was coming to an end. "I have to go back," he said finally. "If I don't challenge my brother's claim now, He'll have time to consolidate power in ways that will make it impossible to remove him peacefully. I know. Come with me." The words were out before he seemed to realize he was going to say them, not as a subject returning to the kingdom, but as... He stopped, shaking his head. The impossibility of their situation pressed down on them both. She was an exiled Omega with a price on her head. He was a supposedly dead king, whose only chance of reclaiming his throne lay in moving quickly and decisively. Whatever their personal feelings, the political realities remained unchanged. "As what?" she asked quietly. "As my partner, my equal, the person I want to rebuild this kingdom with." He turned to face her fully. "Elira, the prophecies you mentioned, about the reuniting of bloodlines, the healing of ancient divisions, what if they're not just stories? What if we're meant to fulfill them?" The pendant at her throat pulsed with warm light, as if responding to the possibility inherent in his words. But Elira had lived through too much loss to embrace hope without considering its cost. "And if we fail, if your brother kills you before you can press your claim, or if the nobles refuse to accept an Omega as queen..." She met his eyes steadily. "What then?" "Then we will have tried to create something better, even if we don't succeed." His voice carried a conviction that reminded her why men had followed him into battle. "But Elira, I believe we can succeed. Together, drawing on both our strengths, both our traditions, I believe we can heal what's been broken." Looking at him in the firelight, seeing the man he had become through pain and discovery, Elira felt the last of her defenses crumble. She had spent 7 years protecting herself from exactly this kind of hope. This dangerous possibility that love and courage might be enough to change the world. But the pendant's warmth against her skin seemed to whisper that some risks were worth taking, especially when the alternative was letting fear dictate the shape of their lives. "Yes," she said simply. "I'll come with you." The word hung between them, heavy with promise and peril in equal measure, as outside the spring rain continued to wash the world clean. The discovery came by accident, as the most devastating revelations often do. While packing Torric's few belongings for their return to the kingdom, Elira's fingers found something hard sewn into the lining of his travel pack, a small glass vial, no larger than her thumb, containing traces of a crystalline residue. She held it up to the light, her healer's training immediately recognizing the telltale shimmer of processed nightshade, refined into a form that would be nearly undetectable in food or drink. This wasn't the crude poison of common assassins, but something far more sophisticated, designed to kill slowly, creating symptoms that would mimic natural illness or battlefield injuries. "Torric," she called, her voice tight with alarm. He emerged from behind the cottage where he'd been checking their supplies, took one look at her face, and crossed to her side in 3 quick strides. "What is it?" She held up the vial without speaking, watching as understanding dawned in his eyes. His face went pale, then flushed with an anger she'd never seen in him before. "Where did you find this?" "Sewn into your peck's lining. Someone wanted to make sure you carried it with you, probably without knowing." She turned the vial carefully, noting how the light caught the residue. "This is Ghost Kiss, a refined poison that takes weeks to kill. The victim appears to die of natural causes, usually attributed to existing wounds or illness." Torric sank into one of her chairs, the implications hitting him like physical blows. "The ambush wasn't meant to kill me outright. It was meant to wound me, slow me down, ensure I'd be forced to use the supplies in my pack." "Where did this pack come from?" "My brother gave it to me personally the morning I left for the border patrol. Said it contained emergency supplies, medicines in case I was injured, far from help." His voice was hollow with betrayal. "He embraced me when he handed it over, told me to be careful, to come back safely." Elira felt sick as the full scope of the deception became clear. "He didn't just orchestrate the ambush, Torric. He's been planning your murder for months, maybe longer. The poison, the staged death scene Willem described, the rapid move toward coronation, all of it was carefully coordinated. But why not just kill me cleanly? Why this elaborate charade?" She set the vial down carefully, her mind working through the political calculations involved. Because if you died obviously by his hand, he'd face questions about succession rights. Other nobles might challenge his claim or demand investigations. But if you died apparently in battle, wounded while defending the kingdom, he becomes not just the obvious successor, but a tragic figure worthy of sympathy. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of betrayal. Torric had been raised with his younger brother, protected him, trusted him with the most sensitive matters of state. To discover that Aldrich had been planning his murder was devastating enough. But the calculated cruelty of the method made it infinitely worse. "There's more," Torric said quietly, his voice distant as memories began to align into new patterns. The Omega persecution, Aldrich was one of its strongest advocates. He brought me reports of dangerous magical activities, evidence of seditious activities among Omega families, evidence that you now suspect was fabricated, evidence that I now know was fabricated. He looked up at her, his expression stricken. "Your father wasn't the only one who tried to warn me about inconsistencies in the reports. There were others, advisors, courtiers, even some nobles who questioned whether the threat was real. But Aldrich always had explanations, additional evidence, reasons why caution was dangerous." Elira felt the room spinning as the full scope of the conspiracy became apparent. He orchestrated the entire persecution to eliminate potential opposition to his eventual coup. Omega families weren't just scapegoats, they were specific targets because their gifts might have enabled them to see through his deceptions. My God, Torric buried his face in his hands. How many people died because I was too trusting, too willing to believe my own brother? She moved to stand beside his chair, her hand finding his shoulder. Even in her own moment of horror at the revelation, she recognized his need for comfort. "You couldn't have known." Blood bonds are supposed to mean something. The idea that your own brother would orchestrate such devastation was literally unthinkable. But I should have questioned more, investigated personally, instead of relying on reports. And if you had, you likely would have discovered his plans earlier and ended up dead sooner. She squeezed his shoulder gently. "Torric, this changes everything about our return to the kingdom. It's not just about challenging his legitimacy anymore. It's about exposing a conspiracy that reaches back years and cost hundreds of lives." He looked up at her, and she saw that the shock was giving way to something harder and more determined. "The evidence. We need evidence that will convince the noble council, something more substantial than our word against his. What about the reports he gave you about Omega activities? If they were falsified, there might be inconsistencies we could expose. Possibly. But those documents are in the castle, and Aldrich would have had years to refine or destroy any evidence that might implicate him." Torric stood, pacing to the window as his mind worked through possibilities. "We need to approach this differently. Instead of trying to prove what he did, we need to let him reveal himself. How? By giving him exactly what he thinks he wants. My apparent death confirmed, his coronation proceeding as planned. But this time, I'll be watching from the shadows, gathering evidence as he makes the mistakes that confident conspirators always make." Elira felt her heart clench at the implications of this plan. "That's incredibly dangerous. If he realizes you're alive, if he realizes I'm alive, he'll try to finish what he started. But that attempt might be exactly the proof we need." Torric turned back to her, his expression grave but determined. "There's something else to consider. If Aldrich has been planning this for years, he won't stop with just claiming the throne. He'll move against anyone who might threaten his rule, including you. Once he realizes the exiled Omega healer has abilities that make her dangerous to his narrative. The truth of this settled over her like a cold weight. Her growing reputation among the forest folk, combined with her obvious connection to Torric, would make her a target, regardless of whether they actively opposed Aldrich's rule. "Then we have no choice but to fight," she said simply. "We do have a choice." His voice was gentle but firm. "I could arrange for you to disappear, to find sanctuary somewhere far from this kingdom. You've already given me more than anyone could reasonably expect. No, The word came out sharper than she'd intended. "I've spent 7 years running from the consequences of other people's choices. I won't do it again, especially not when I finally have a chance to make things right." They looked at each other across the small cottage. Two people who had found something precious in the midst of devastation and were now faced with the choice of whether to risk everything to protect it. "There's one more thing," Elira said, her hand moving unconsciously to the pendant at her throat. "The prophecies I mentioned about the reuniting of bloodlines and the healing of ancient divisions. If they're true, if we're meant to fulfill them, then running away isn't really an option. We'd just be postponing the confrontation, not avoiding it. And if we're wrong about the prophecies, if we're just two people caught up in circumstances larger than ourselves." She considered the question seriously, then smiled with a confidence that surprised them both. "Then we'll still be two people choosing to fight for something better instead of accepting something evil. That has to count for something." Outside, the spring rain had intensified, drumming against the cottage roof with a rhythm that sounded almost like marching feet. Time was running short, and they both knew it. Aldric's coronation was proceeding. His plans were in motion, and every day they delayed gave him more opportunities to consolidate power. But they also knew that rushing back unprepared would be suicide. They needed allies, evidence, and a strategy that could expose the truth without getting them killed in the process. "Willem," Torric said suddenly. He mentioned a network of loyal supporters. "If we're going to do this, we'll need people on the inside, people who can gather intelligence and help us move unseen. And we'll need proof of the poisoning plot," Elira added, holding up the vial again. "This residue might be analyzed, compared to substances found in official castle stores. Then we have our starting point." Torric's voice carried the authority she remembered from stories of his battlefield leadership. "We return to the kingdom not as refugees seeking sanctuary, but as agents working to expose a conspiracy and restore legitimate rule." The plan was dangerous, possibly suicidal, but it offered something that running away never could: the chance to heal the wounds that Aldric's machinations had inflicted on the entire kingdom. As they began to plan in earnest, the pendant at Elira's throat glowed with steady warmth, as if approving of their choice to fight for truth rather than accept comfortable lies. The war banner had been hidden in Willem's cabin for 15 years, wrapped in oiled leather and stored beneath loose floorboards like a sacred relic waiting for its moment of resurrection. When the old tracker unveiled it, Elira felt her breath catch at the sight of the crowned wolf emblem, its silver threads still gleaming against the deep blue field, despite years of concealment. "Your father carried this at the Battle of Thornwood," Willem told Torric, his weathered hands gentle as they spread the banner across his rough wooden table. "I cut it down from his tent after he fell, thought it might be needed someday for his son to claim his rightful place." Torric stared at the banner, his fingers tracing the intricate embroidery that spoke of a craftsman's pride in creating something meant to inspire loyalty and courage. "I remember this. He used to let me hold the staff when I was very young. He told me that someday I'd carry it into battle for the good of our people. Aye, and that day's come, though not in the way any of us expected." Willem's expression was grave as he outlined what his network of contacts had discovered about Aldric's preparations. "Your brother's moved faster than we thought. The coronation's been moved up. It's set for tomorrow night, using the excuse that the kingdom can't remain without a crowned ruler during uncertain times." "Tomorrow?" Elira felt her heart race. They'd been planning for weeks, but this acceleration meant they were running out of time to gather the evidence and allies they needed. "There's more," Willem continued. "He's issued a general amnesty for anyone who comes forward with information about dangerous Omega survivors, promising rewards for their capture. The descriptions being circulated match you perfectly. Lass, right down to the healing pendant you wear." Elira's hand moved unconsciously to her throat, where the moonstone pendant rested against her skin. It had been glowing almost continuously since they'd discovered the poison vial. as if responding to the increasing urgency of their situation. "We can't wait any longer," Torric said, his voice carrying the authority of decision. "If we're going to act, it has to be now, before he consolidates power completely." Over the following hours, Willem's cabin became a planning center as loyal supporters began to arrive. Men and women who had served the crown faithfully for decades and recognized that something was fundamentally wrong with Aldric's rapid rise to power. There was Captain Morris, whose border patrol had been mysteriously reassigned the day before Torric's ambush. Lady Catherine, whose husband had been one of the advisors who'd questioned the Omega persecution and died shortly afterward in a hunting accident. Master Thomas, the castle's head groom, who'd noticed unusual activity in the stables on the night before Torric's departure. Each brought pieces of a puzzle that, assembled together, painted a picture of conspiracy stretching back years. But they also brought sobering news about Aldric's current strength, control of the royal guard, alliances with powerful nobles, and a propaganda campaign that portrayed him as the kingdom's savior from chaos and magical threats. "The coronation ceremony will be held in the Great Hall," Captain Morris reported, unrolling architectural plans of the castle. Traditional protocol calls for all major nobles to attend, plus representatives from the guilds and military leadership. "Security will be overwhelming. Aldric's taken no chances. What about the ancient protocols?" Lady Catherine asked. "The old laws that govern succession and coronation ceremonies?" Torric studied the castle plans, his mind working through possibilities. "There are provisions for challenging a coronation if the rightful heir appears before the crown is actually placed. But it would require irrefutable proof of identity and legitimacy." "The banner would help with identity," Willem noted. "But legitimacy, that's where the poison evidence becomes crucial. If we can prove Aldric attempted to murder you, we need more than just the vial," Elira interjected. "We need witnesses, documentation, something that connects the poison directly to him." It was Master Thomas who provided the breakthrough. "The night before you left for the border patrol, my lord, I saw Prince Aldric in the stables very late, meeting with someone I didn't recognize. They exchanged something small, could have been a vial like the one you found. Can you identify this person?" "Not by sight, but I overheard part of their conversation. The stranger mentioned something about northern contacts, and ensuring the timing was perfect for maximum effect. The pieces were falling into place, but Elira could see the weight of leadership settling on Torric's shoulders as he realized the magnitude of what they were attempting. They weren't just challenging Aldric's claim to the throne. They were exposing a conspiracy that had cost hundreds of lives and reshaped the kingdom's entire social structure. "There's something else we need to consider," she said quietly. "My presence at the coronation will complicate everything. Even if we prove Aldric's guilt, the nobles might not accept an Omega as queen. Then we change their understanding of what it means to be Omega," Torric replied, his voice firm with conviction. "Your abilities, your healing gifts, your knowledge, these aren't threats to the kingdom's stability. They're exactly what the kingdom needs to heal from years of division and fear." As evening approached, their plans took final shape. They would infiltrate the castle during the coronation ceremony, using servants' passages and Willem's knowledge of the building's hidden ways. At the crucial moment, when Aldric was about to receive the crown, they would present themselves publicly, challenge his legitimacy, and reveal the evidence of his conspiracy. It was an audacious plan, with 1,000 ways to fail catastrophically. But it was also their only chance to prevent Aldric from consolidating power permanently. As their supporters prepared to depart for their various roles in the morning's events, Elira found herself alone with Torric for what might be their final private moments. The weight of everything they were risking hung between them, not just their lives, but their chance at the love they'd discovered in the forest cottage. "Are you afraid?" she asked him, as they stood together in Willem's small garden, watching stars emerge in the clear night sky. "Terrified," he admitted. "Not of dying, I've faced that possibility before, but of failing, of watching Aldrich destroy everything good that remains in this kingdom while I stand helpless to prevent it. She moved closer, taking his hands in hers. The pendant at her throat was warm against her skin, pulsing gently with the rhythm of her heartbeat. We won't fail. How can you be so certain? Because this isn't just about politics or power anymore. It's about love. Love for the people who've been hurt, love for the kingdom that could be, love for each other. She looked up at him, seeing her own hopes and fears reflected in his eyes. That kind of love doesn't fail, even when everything else does. They held each other in the starlight, drawing strength from their connection as they prepared to risk everything for the chance to heal their wounded world. Around them, the forest whispered with the sounds of night, owls calling, small creatures moving through underbrush, the distant sound of water flowing over stones. It was a peaceful sound, the kind of harmony they hoped to restore to their kingdom if they survived the trials ahead. Whatever happens tomorrow, Torric murmured against her hair. I want you to know that finding you in that snowstorm was the greatest gift of my life, even if it cost you your throne. Especially if it cost me my throne. He pulled back to look at her directly. I was dead inside long before my brother's poison could have killed my body. You brought me back to life, Elira. You reminded me who I was meant to be. The pendant's glow intensified, visible even in the moonlight, as if responding to the depth of emotion between them. In that light, Elira saw not the fallen king she'd rescued from the snow, but the man he was becoming, someone strong enough to admit his failures, wise enough to seek partnership rather than dominance, brave enough to risk everything for the chance to do better. Then let's go claim your throne, she said, her voice steady with resolve. Not for the crown or the power, but for the chance to build something worthy of the love we've found. They spent their final hour before dawn in quiet preparation, checking weapons, reviewing plans, sharing the kind of silences that only exist between people who trust each other completely. When the first light began to creep over the eastern mountains, they were ready. The cottage in the forest, their sanctuary of healing and discovery, would wait for their return. But first, they had a kingdom to save and a future to claim, armed with nothing more than truth, courage, and the ancient power of love that had always been stronger than fear. As they set out for the castle and the confrontation that would determine not just their fate, but the fate of everyone they sought to protect. The pendant at Elira's throat blazed with light, bright enough to guide them through whatever darkness lay ahead. The castle had never looked more imposing than it did in the pre-dawn darkness, its towers reaching toward clouded skies like accusing fingers. Elira followed Willem and Torric through the network of service tunnels that honeycombed the ancient structure, her heart hammering against her ribs as they navigated passages she'd known as a child but hadn't seen for 7 years. The sounds of preparation echoed through the stone corridors, servants rushing to complete decorations, guards taking their positions, musicians tuning instruments for the ceremony that would legitimize Aldrich's rule. It was surreal to move through these familiar spaces as a fugitive, knowing that discovery would mean immediate death for all of them. Here, Willem whispered, stopping at a junction of tunnels. This passage leads to the alcove behind the throne dais. You'll be able to see everything that happens. And when the moment comes, we'll be ready, Torric assured him, his voice steady despite the magnitude of what they were attempting. Willem clasped Torric's shoulder briefly, then melted away into the shadows to coordinate with their other allies. Elira and Torric were alone now, crouched in the narrow space that would be their hiding place until the crucial moment arrived. Through the thin wooden screen that concealed the alcove, they could see the great hall being prepared for ceremony. Banners hung from every pillar, flowers decorated every surface, and servants polished the ancient throne until it gleamed in the torchlight. The sight of it all, the pageantry designed to legitimize a usurper, made Elira's stomach clench with anger. There, Torric breathed. Pointing through the screen, Aldrich strode into the hall, and Elira got her first clear look at the man who had orchestrated so much suffering. He was younger than Torric by perhaps 5 years, handsome in a sharp-featured way that spoke of intelligence and ambition. But there was something in his bearing, a satisfaction, almost smugness, that suggested a man supremely confident in his own cleverness. "My lord," a courtier approached Aldrich with obvious deference. "The lords and ladies have begun arriving. The ceremony can commence within the hour." "Excellent!" Aldrich's voice carried easily across the hall, cultured and authoritative. "And what news of the Omega Witch who's been causing trouble in the forests?" Elira felt Torric tense beside her, his hand instinctively moving toward his sword. "No confirmed sightings, my lord, but our patrols are expanding their search. The bounty you've placed should motivate the peasants to be more observant." "Good. I want her found and dealt with before she can spread any more of her poisonous influence." Aldrich's tone was casual, as if discussing the extermination of vermin rather than the murder of a human being. "The kingdom has endured quite enough magical disruption." As the hall filled with nobles and dignitaries, Elira recognized faces from her childhood, men and women who had known her father, who had benefited from his healing arts. Some looked genuinely pleased to be attending the coronation, but others seemed troubled, their expressions suggesting they harbored doubts about the rapid succession. The ceremony began with traditional fanfare, but Elira noticed the subtle deviations from proper protocol, the haste with which certain rituals were abbreviated, the absence of some of the ancient challenges and confirmations that should have accompanied a legitimate coronation. "He's rushing through the binding portions," Torric whispered. "Once the crown is on his head and the oaths are spoken, it becomes much more difficult to challenge his legitimacy." The moment was approaching rapidly. Archbishop Mallory, an elderly man who had served the kingdom for decades, approached the throne carrying the ancient crown, the same artifact that had supposedly responded only to rightful rulers in the old. "Stories, my lords and ladies," the archbishop's voice rang out over the assembled crowd. "We gather today to witness the coronation of King Aldrich, rightful heir to the throne of our realm, chosen by divine providence to lead us through these troubled times." Aldrich knelt before the throne, his head bowed in apparent humility, but Elira could see the tension in his shoulders, the eagerness of a man about to claim the prize he'd schemed for years to obtain. "Do you, Aldrich of the House of the Wolf, solemnly swear to rule with justice and wisdom, to protect the weak and defend the realm against all enemies?" "I do so swear." The archbishop lifted the crown, its ancient gold catching the light from 100 torches. This was it, the moment when they had to act or lose their chance forever. Elira felt the pendant at her throat begin to burn against her skin, its light growing so bright that she had to press it beneath her tunic to prevent it from giving away their position. Something was happening, something that went beyond their personal mission of revenge and justice. "Then, by the authority vested in me by God and tradition, I crown you—" "Stop." Torric's voice cut through the ceremony like a blade through silk, and Elira heard the collective gasp of the assembled nobles as he stepped through the concealed doorway and into the great hall, the royal war banner unfurling behind him like a phoenix rising from ashes. The crown slipped from the archbishop's startled hands, clattering to the stone floor as every eye in the hall turned toward the figure who should have been dead, who was supposed to be nothing but a memory and a convenient justification for his brother's rise to power. "I am Torric, rightful king of this realm," his voice carried to every corner of the hall, commanding and unmistakable. "And I challenge the legitimacy of this coronation." The silence that followed Torric's declaration was deafening, broken only by the sound of steel being drawn as guards throughout the hall reached for their weapons. But they hesitated, caught between conflicting loyalties, duty to the crown prince who had commanded them for months, and recognition of the king they had served for years. Aldrich's face cycled through a dozen emotions in the space of heartbeats. Shock, fear, rage, and finally a calculating coldness that confirmed everything Elira had suspected about his true nature. "Seize the impostor," Aldrich commanded, his voice cracking slightly on the words. This man is clearly an enemy agent, using dark magic to assume the appearance of my dead brother. But several of the guards took steps backward rather than forward, their eyes fixed on Torric with growing recognition. Captain Morris stepped forward from the crowd, his weathered face grave but certain. "That's no impostor, my prince. That's King Torric himself, bearing his father's banner and carrying himself with the bearing I've known for 20 years. "Impossible," Aldrich snarled. "I have proof of his death, bloodied clothing, witnesses to the ambush. Witnesses you paid, evidence you planted," Torric replied, his voice cutting through his brother's protests with quiet authority. "Just as you planted this in my traveling pack." He held up the poison vial, and Elira saw several nobles lean forward with sudden interest. "What is that?" Archbishop Mallory demanded, his elderly voice sharp with suspicion. "Ghost kiss poison, refined to kill slowly while mimicking natural illness." Torric's words carried to every corner of the hall. "Sewn into supplies my brother personally gave me before I departed for the border patrol." Aldrich's face had gone pale, but he rallied quickly. "More lies and fabrications. Even if that vial contains what you claim, there's no proof I placed it there." "Isn't there?" The voice came from behind Elira, and she turned to see Master Thomas emerging from another concealed entrance, his usual deference replaced by grim determination. "I saw Prince Aldrich in the stables the night before the king's departure, meeting with a stranger and exchanging something small, something that could easily have been this vial." They spoke of northern contacts and perfect timing for maximum effect. Murmurs began to ripple through the assembled nobles. But Aldrich wasn't finished. His hand moved to his sword as his composure finally cracked completely. "Enough of this charade," he roared. "Even if my brother lives, even if he's fabricated evidence against me, he's forfeited his right to rule. Look who he brings with him. A known Omega witch, one of the dangerous creatures we've worked so hard to eliminate." All eyes turned toward the alcove, where Elira still waited, and she knew the moment of decision had arrived. She could remain hidden, let Torric fight this battle alone, or she could step forward and claim her place in the confrontation that would determine the kingdom's future. The pendant at her throat blazed with heat so intense it was almost painful, and in that warmth she felt the presence of her father, her grandmother, all the Omega ancestors whose wisdom and power had been suppressed but never truly destroyed. She emerged from concealment, the pendant's light now visible even through her clothing, casting an ethereal glow that made the torchlight seem dim by comparison. The reaction was immediate. Gasps of fear from some nobles, wonder from others, and from Aldrich, a look of pure hatred. "Behold the true threat to our kingdom," he declared, pointing at her with a shaking finger. "The Omega witch who has corrupted our rightful king with her unnatural powers. I am Elira, daughter of Marcus the Healer, last of the Silverwood line," she replied, her voice carrying with a clarity that seemed to fill every corner of the vast hall. "And I have come to heal what has been broken by lies and fear." The pendant's light pulsed brighter, and something remarkable happened. Throughout the hall, people began to remember. Nobles recalled the wisdom of Omega advisors their grandfathers had trusted. Guards remembered the healing touch of Omega physicians who had saved their lives. Servants whispered of the peace that had existed before the persecution began. But Aldrich saw only the collapse of his carefully constructed narrative. With a sound of pure rage, he drew his sword and lunged toward Elira, intent on ending the threat she represented to his reign. Torric moved to intercept him, their blades meeting in a clash of steel that rang through the hall like a bell. The brothers circled each other, years of suppressed conflict finally erupting into violence. "You were always weak, brother," Aldrich snarled as they fought. "Too trusting, too willing to believe in the goodness of others. I would have been a stronger king." "Strength isn't about inspiring fear," Torric replied, his swordwork precise and controlled despite his anger. "It's about inspiring hope." As the brothers battled, something else was happening in the hall. The crown that had fallen to the floor during the interrupted ceremony began to glow with its own inner light. responding to the presence of both royal blood and the ancient power that Elira carried. The true crown of legend, Elira realized. The artifact that would only accept a ruler who embodied both strength and wisdom, both alpha authority and omega compassion. The fight between the brothers reached its climax as Aldrich, desperate and cornered, attempted a killing blow. But Torric was ready, his counterstrike knocking the sword from his brother's hand and sending him sprawling to the floor at the foot of the throne. "It's over." "Aldrich," Torric said, his sword point at his brother's throat. "Surrender, and I'll show you the mercy you showed to none of our people." For a moment the hall held its breath. Then Aldrich's shoulders sagged in defeat, and the last challenge to Torric's rightful rule crumbled into silence. Archbishop Mallory, his face pale but resolute, picked up the still-glowing crown and approached the throne, where Torric now stood with Elira beside him. "The crown has chosen," the old man said simply. "Long live the king, long live the queen," as the ancient words of acclamation rang through the hall. Elira felt the pendant's warmth settle into something deeper than heat, the profound satisfaction of prophecy fulfilled and ancient wounds finally beginning to heal. 6 months later, the castle's great courtyard buzzed with activity that would have been unthinkable during the years of Omega persecution. Healing tents stood alongside merchant stalls, their banners bearing the intertwined wolf and moon symbols of the newly unified kingdom. Former exiles worked alongside lifelong citizens, their various talents contributing to a prosperity that had seemed impossible just seasons before. Elira stood at the window of her chambers, rooms that had once belonged to queens but had been empty for years, watching the activity below with a sense of wonder that hadn't diminished despite months of witnessing such scenes. The pendant at her throat rested quietly against her skin now, its urgent glow replaced by a steady warmth that spoke of work well done and promises kept. "The morning reports," Torric said, entering their shared study with an armful of documents. But instead of the grim intelligence briefings that had dominated his early reign, these papers spoke of healing centers established, trade routes reopened, and refugees returning home. "Anything that requires immediate attention?" she asked, though they both knew that the kingdom's most pressing crises had been resolved in the weeks following the coronation. "Lord Aldrich's trial is scheduled to conclude next week," he replied, settling into the chair beside hers. "The evidence is overwhelming. The court will likely sentence him to exile rather than execution." It had been Elira's suggestion that they show mercy to Aldrich despite the enormity of his crimes. Not from any sense that he deserved forgiveness, but from a recognition that the kingdom needed to begin a new chapter based on justice rather than revenge. "And the Omega Registry?" she asked, referencing the massive undertaking to document and restore the rights of all survivors of the persecution. "Nearly complete. We've identified over 300 survivors, plus another 100 children born in exile who are now free to return." His voice carried satisfaction, tinged with ongoing grief for those who would never return. "The reparations fund is fully established, and the new laws protecting Omega rights have been ratified by all the provincial councils." They worked in comfortable silence for a while, reviewing proposals for new healing centers and trade agreements with neighboring kingdoms that had watched the transformation with fascination. Word of the Omega Queen had spread beyond their borders, attracting delegations from rulers curious about this unprecedented sharing of power between Alpha and Omega bloodlines. It was Willem who brought the news that would complete the circle of their story. The old tracker appeared in their doorway with his usual lack of ceremony, but his weathered face carried an excitement she hadn't seen since the night they'd planned their infiltration of the castle. "Thought you'd want to know," he said without preamble. "Young Sarah from the eastern province came through this morning. She's got the sight, same as her grandmother did before the troubles started. Asked if she could apprentice with the Queen, learn the old ways properly." Elira felt her heart lift at the prospect. Since their coronation, She'd been working to preserve and transmit the healing knowledge that had nearly been lost during the persecution. But having a student, someone to carry the wisdom forward, would make that work feel complete in a way she hadn't expected. "Send her to me tomorrow morning," she said. "We'll start with the basic herbs and see how she responds to the deeper teachings." After Willem left, Elira found herself thinking about the cottage in the forest, their sanctuary of healing and discovery that had been maintained exactly as they'd left it. They returned there regularly, both for the peace it offered and as a reminder of the love that had grown between them during those transformative weeks. "There's something else," Torric said, his voice carrying a note of anticipation that made her look up from her papers. "Dr. Elizabeth finished her examination this morning." The words hung between them, weighted with hope and possibility. They had been trying for an heir since their marriage, knowing that the kingdom's stability would be enhanced by a clear succession. But more than political necessity, they wanted a child who would grow up in the healed world they were creating, someone who would never know the divisions and fears that had shaped their own early lives. "And?" she prompted, though the warmth spreading through her chest suggested she already knew the answer. "You're with child," he said, his voice soft with wonder. "Our son or daughter will be born just as the winter snows begin to melt." The timing was perfect, almost poetic in its symbolism. Their child would arrive with the spring thaw, just as the kingdom itself was emerging from a long winter of division and fear. Elira placed her hand over her still flat stomach, marveling at the life growing within her. This child would be the living embodiment of the prophecy, Alpha and Omega bloodlines united, representing not domination by one over the other, but partnership in service of something greater than either could achieve alone. "The promise is fulfilled," she said, remembering that desperate night when a dying king had spoken words that seemed impossible at the time. "You vowed that I would carry your son before the snow melts." "Our son or daughter," he corrected, but his smile acknowledged the weight of fulfilled prophecy. "Though given everything we've seen of old magic and ancient wisdom, I suspect the timing isn't coincidental." That evening, they walked through the castle grounds as they did most nights, observing the life that flourished where fear had once ruled. Former enemies worked side by side, Alpha nobles consulted with Omega advisors, and children played games that mixed traditions from both cultures. The pendant at Elira's throat pulsed gently, responding to the new life she carried and the healed kingdom that surrounded them. In the distance, she could see lights beginning to appear in windows throughout the city, families gathering for evening meals, students studying in the new libraries, healers tending to those who needed care. It was a good world, she reflected. Not perfect, no world ever was, but founded on principles that honored both strength and compassion, both tradition and change. Their child would grow up knowing that love could triumph over fear, that healing was possible even after the deepest wounds, and that sometimes the most profound transformations began with simple acts of kindness offered to strangers in the snow as they stood together in the gathering dusk. Watching their kingdom settle into peaceful evening, Elira felt the profound satisfaction that came from work well done and promises kept. The snow would melt again in a few months, revealing a world renewed. And when it did, their child would be there to greet it, living proof that love truly could conquer all.